All right, good morning and afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So today we're going to do a 2-for-1. We're looking at 97 through 101 and 101 through 105. And really the reason I'm doing that is because they kind of tie into each other. So if we're looking at the differentiating between dual, cooperative, and centralized federalism, the big focus really for you guys is dual and cooperative, and then we're going to talk about how cooperative will transform into centralized and then eventually conflicted federalism. Then for the next part of the reading, we're looking at, the section I really wanted to focus on was categorical grants, block grants, and mandates, and how they are part of federalism and how they work with that intergovernmental relationship between the national government and states. And then finally, we'll leave off with how the constitutional amendments have changed the nature of federalism over the last 180, 190 years. All right, so let's jump into the first part of this, and let's go ahead and look at the classic Venn diagram. Now, if we're looking at this in the classical context, we often refer to this as dual federalism, aka layer cake federalism, because there were two distinct spheres. You had all your state stuff on one side, your national stuff on the other side, and then you had your concurrent powers. So, to be honest, on a daily basis, most people were affected by just what we see in this red circle. Of course, your concurrent stuff happening too, but this is about the extent of the limited interaction people had with the national government. Taxes, banks, borrowing money, courts, that was it. There wasn't a lot of stuff over here for the average person to deal with on a daily basis in their lives, and even today that's kind of true. So they call it layer cake federalism because you could clearly see what was a state power at the time and what was a national power. And the Supreme Court actually went ahead and, for a long time, supported this idea, saying there were two different spheres. That's a state power, that's a national power, they're separate. This also worked for practical reasons, too, because we tend to forget, living in 2019, that we have instant communication today and travel that is so easy. Literally, I can get on a plane today and be in Washington by the end of the day having dinner with a friend. And vice versa, I can jump on a plane at lunch in Washington and be in California, again, for dinner, no problem. And that happens so frequently nowadays, we forget that travel is easy. But for the first 100+ years of American history, travel was not an easy thing. And it took you time to get places. And so big things happening at the national level in Washington didn't really affect most people in their local communities. And in fact, it was the local governments that affected them. So this kind of federalism worked for a practical reason, in that you just couldn't hop on a plane or a train and get somewhere quickly. It took you time to get places. And it wasn't up until the last 100 years where it was actually much easier to travel around the United States, until we get to today, 2019, where I can communicate, online with people across the country and the world easily, or I can jump on a plane and be all the way across the country by the end of the day. So this kind of federalism worked well for that time period because you operated at the local level for most things in your life, and you didn't travel much, and you dealt with, your local governments. So this kind of federalism worked very, very well for a long time. So let me just show you another image real quick. So these are the two analogies we often use, the layer cake federalism, because if you look at a layer cake, you can see the clear different separations. You have, national here, state over here, and I know this layer cake's 3 layers. We don't need to get into that, but, you have a part in the middle, that would be your concurrent powers, and that's often how they described it, was, you can clearly cut a piece of cake and say, this is one thing, this is another thing, and here's a little bit in the middle that connects them, and that's it. And then we're going to move on to the analogy of the marble cake style of federalism. But let's go ahead and look at the next one. And again, it's the same thing you've already seen, except we're moving now into the era of cooperative federalism. So under cooperative federalism, and this kind of started with the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, and trying to get out of the Great Depression. Okay, we also call this marble cake federalism, and then I included in here centralized, because eventually cooperative will become centralized federalism later on under people like Lyndon LBJ, president, and other leaders. So under the idea of cooperative federalism, and it started out during the Great Depression, is that the federal government said, hey, we need to spend some money, we need to help stimulate the economy. So they started working with states, and I drew a purple arrow because they're working together. And one of the things it's really easy to illustrate is building infrastructure and building roads, dams, and ports. And the government said, all right, the national government said, okay, we need to help states by building more infrastructure because we need to put people to work. And the easiest way to do that is to build roads. That's something cheap, efficient, and gets people working. So they said, hey, states, let's work together. And the states said, great. Hey, I need a road from San Bernardino, California, all the way up to, the backside of the eastern Sierra Nevadas. And the national government said, great idea. Here, we'll give you a bunch of money, and let's build that together. So it's a relationship where they're working together and building roads all over the United States and putting in power lines and more rail lines and building ports where, you can have ships coming in and building dams to help regulate the flow of rivers, which are also used for transportation. And that becomes a really important thing. And they're working together for quite a few years to just, build infrastructure around the country, which is going to lead to America becoming the country it is today. But they're working together. And that would be cooperative federalism, because it really is kind of like the states talking to the national government. Hey, let's work together. Great. Here's my idea. Here's my idea. Let's put something together for both of us. That's why it's called cooperative federalism. So that arrow goes both ways here. But there's a but here. The national government realizes it can get more done. All they have to do is use a little bit of their money and say, hey, states, yes, I know we're working together, but now we're going to tell you that we're going to do something. It's no longer that cooperative. We're telling you. And this starts slow and then starts to build and build and build because, on one level it's like, hey, yeah, I know we're working together on these roads, but we need you to do this, states. The end. And the states are like, okay, we're getting money from you, we'll do it. And then all of a sudden they're like, well, but we also need to provide for the general welfare. So we're going to do this other thing too. Do this, states. Okay, the states are going to do it because they're getting money. And now they're like, all right, well, we also need to get involved in education because some of you states are not playing fairly. You're discriminated against minorities. So we're going to tell you how to do your education too. We're going to give you money. And if you want that money, you have to follow our rules. Okay. Oh yeah, we're also going to tell you how to, be healthier and safer in your states too. Yes, that's your power, but we know better and we need to make things fair across the country. So here, we're telling you what to do. Here's some money with it. If you want that money, you have to do what we say. And we can see it keeps getting bigger and bigger, including under providing general welfare, conducting elections. Elections happen at the state level, and the states ran them essentially. And this was a way that, African American voters and Hispanic voters became disenfranchised, including also poor voters and women voters. So the national government steps in and says, all right, states, you have to play by a certain set of rules. We're going to set some ground rules for you. So yes, you're in charge of elections, but we're going to tell you how to do those elections, and we're going to tie some money to it, and we're also going to use the Supreme Court if we have to. So we're going to force you to do certain things with your elections, even though you're in charge of them. And so they set some ground rules, and even nowadays, basic ground rules. In order to vote, you have to be a citizen of the United States, you have to be a resident of the state in which you're currently voting, you have to be 18 years or older. And basically the national government is, making states follow those three basic rules. There used to be things like poll taxes and grandfather clauses and all that states would use to disenfranchise. And again, that's one of your key vocabulary terms that we're going to talk about in Unit 2. Disenfranchise means take away your right to vote. Enfranchisement means you have a right to vote. So states would use that power to conduct elections to take away those powers. And the national government stepped in and said, no, some of you states are not playing by the rules. We're going to do things differently. Also, when it comes to redistricting U.S. houses, and we're going to talk about that a lot in Unit 2, that's really important for Unit 2. We're going to talk about why the national government stepped in and put some rules into place for states. So all of a sudden you see all these arrows over here connecting. And this is going to become really important because, it's really at this point you're seeing the national government telling states what to do. And you see all these green arrows crossing back and forth, and there's an influence. And this is why we come back to that marble cake analogy, in that, we have the national government mixed up with the state governments, and it's hard to tell which one's which now because, yes, providing education belongs to the state, but there's a national Department of Education that makes sure that education is done fairly in all the states, and there's also money tied to it now. and there's influence at the state level. States listen to what the national government's saying. So is it really just the state's power now, or is the national government influencing it? And that really has happened. So that's why they call this the marble cake federalism. Now, this also starts to become centralized federalism, because now all these green arrows are the national government telling states what to do. So this is why I combine this, because that purple arrow was cooperative federalism. Yes, let's work together. I have my input, you have your input. We're going to come together as a team and do this. And then all of a sudden, it starts to transform, where the national government starts telling states what to do with these green arrows and using money to get the states to do what they want. And why I say this is because we're going to come to the next one, and in the next slide, we're talking about how they do this. So the way they use these arrows to tell states what to do is the next set of reading. This is that 97 through 101. Oh, no, the next bit. This is categorical grants, block grants, and mandates. That's how they do these things. These green arrows are those things. So let's go ahead and take a look at what this means. And these are key terms. I've highlighted them for you. They're in the book. You should have already written these down. I'm not going to read them for you. Instead, I'm going to give you my analogy for what these grants are. So categorical grants are with strings attached. So my analogy here is your parents and you. So a categorical grant would be your parents giving you $100 for school, but they're having a lot of rules on this $100. You have to spend it on school stuff only. And they're going to want to see receipts. And if you spend money on something that's not school related, you're going to have to pay your parents back for that. So let's say that, they give you $100 for school. They're really expecting a backpack, school supplies, maybe, one of those really nice, calculators that you need for school, but it doesn't include shoes. And you need new shoes for school anyway, so you try to tell your parents, oh no, I needed new shoes for school. The way the categorical grant style would work is your parents would be like, yeah, but that doesn't really count, so you're going to have to use your own money, so you're going to have to pay us back for those shoes. Okay? And there's a lot of strings attached with this money. So you can only use it for very specific things, and you have to get approval sometimes. Like, you might even have to ask your parents ahead of time, hey, here's my money for that school you gave me. Can I buy shoes with this? No. Okay, thank you, I tried. Okay. So there's a lot of strings attached with it. It's very specific. You have to work within the confines of it. I know the book talks about some other stuff, but for my analogy purpose, I think this is easy. Block grant would be your parents giving you $100 and saying, hey, here's $100 for school supplies. Just use it for school-related stuff, and we're good. We're not going to ask a lot of questions. We're just going to give you this money, and whatever you think is appropriate for school, that's what you should use it for. The end, which is great. So, if it's you, what would you rather have? Block grant money or categorical grant money? Clearly block grant, because you can use it much more flexibly and whatever you want, as long as it's for school. So there's a lot of leeway and flexibility there. The next thing are mandates. Okay, and mandates are basically the national government telling states what to do, and this kind of comes in with the supremacy clause. And there are two types of mandates, funded and unfunded. Okay, funded means there's money. Unfunded, there's no money or partial money, and the states are responsible for paying that. So my analogy for you guys would be, a mandate would be your parents telling you, hey, you're going to watch your little brothers and sisters. The end. Because we're mom and dad, you're the oldest, that's what you have to do. There's no arguing here. There's no negotiating. You have to watch them. Now, if we want to take that analogy a little further, a funded mandate would be like your parents are. You're going to watch your brothers and sisters, for the evening. Here's $20 for food. Okay, use that money to pay for food. That would be like a funded mandate, or you can, okay, I'll button Little Caesars pizza, will be good. Unfunded mandate would be like, all right, here's $5 for dinner. If it costs more than that, you pay for it. We might pay you back later, we might not. Okay. And that's kind of how the government operates too with mandates. And some of the more famous mandates would be things like the Americans with Disability Act, where the national government said, all right, states, you have to make sure that all your public buildings have, accessible access for people with disabilities. Now, they didn't get specific on what that means. They also didn't give them any money to deal with that. They just said, all right, make sure your public buildings, so like we're talking courts and, City Hall, are accessible for people with disabilities. But they didn't give specifics, and it's up to the states to do that. So, some of these old buildings had to do elevators up there, and some places they're like, this building's so old, we're just going to scrap this building and build a new one. So the burden of paying for it was really on the states, not the national government. And the national government, of their own too, they made sure that big national buildings were accessible to the public, making them ADA compliance. So that was one of those unfunded mandate things that happened. So those are your three ways that the national government uses to influence the state government on how to do things. And really, I think the keys were block grants and categorical mandates. You have to know the difference between these three when it comes to the test, because they're going to ask you specific questions about how these are affected. So if you have more questions, please ask me. I don't mind doing a follow-up video to explain stuff. Yeah. So I think let's go to the last thing real quick. So constitutional amendments and the evolution of federalism. We have the 13th Amendment, brought about the end of slavery across the entire country. Basically, the national government, with the amendment process, said we're getting rid of slavery, we're abolishing it. And they were able to do this easily with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment because the southern states weren't allowed to vote. They had ceded from the U.S. and they were given a non-status as states. So the northern states were the ones who voted these in, not the southern states, because they had been in the revolution, or not revolution, they'd been in the Civil War. So they kind of did an end around and said, all right, since you guys decided to fight back, we're going to not let you say anything, and we're going to pass these amendments with the states that sided with us. All right, 14th Amendment, it extended the rights of citizenship to individuals. And this is really important because it also did two other things, and we have in quotations due process and equal protection. Those become clauses. So this is the due process clause. There's two parts to it. There's one that's in the 5th Amendment, and then there's another one that's in the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment basically gives the national government more power. It basically lets them tell states, hey, you have to allow everyone to have due process. So we're going to make states follow the same rules that we have to follow when it comes to giving people legal protections. And this is really important. We're going to come back to this later on, but I'll explain in more detail, I think, in Unit 5, why the due process clause is so important. And then the equal protection clause, again, same thing. You're protected equally, from state to state, and the national government makes each state play by the same set of rules. So this is really giving the national government more power here. All right, 16th Amendment, it enhances the government's ability to raise taxes. So before, if you lived in pre-16th Amendment America, you would pay your state taxes, and then your state would then pay the national government taxes. So all the states were taxed equally. You didn't have the burden of having to pay the national government directly. You only paid your in-state tax. You only paid California, and that was it. And then California would pay the national government. But with the 16th Amendment, the national government reached in and said, no, okay, states, we can also directly tax your citizens too. And this is where you have the development of the IRS really becoming a big power, because now they can tax you and I individually, not at the state level. So now, in 2019, I pay state taxes and I also pay federal taxes. So I pay two taxes now because of the 16th Amendment, which, again, gives more power to the national government. And then finally, the 17th Amendment, direct election of U.S. senators. This was important because it allowed you and I to vote directly on our U.S. senators, and it kind of excluded the states from the process, because before the 17th Amendment, if you were looking at it in history, the state legislatures actually picked the U.S. senators and from amongst their own members, and it wasn't voted on directly by you and I. It was actually done at the state legislative level. So the government in Sacramento would pick who our two U.S. senators were. So that gave states a lot of influence on the policymaking process. They had a say in it. When we go to the direct election, they removed the states. So this kind of further eroded the power of states. And that's had an impact on the way we do things. So I think that covers most of it. Let me go back and cover one thing real quick. So if we're talking about these mandates and everything, in your notes it talks about conflicted federalism, and that's what we get to with our modern day era, where we have states now pushing back against some of this stuff. California is an example of that. We legalized marijuana in the state of California, and it's a pushback against the national government, providing for the general welfare and then taxes. We're pushing back saying, hey, that's actually belongs to the states. It doesn't belong to the national government. So Other states are doing this too with other issues, but there's this new push within government, state level government, to take back some of the power, to cut some of these ties from the national government, or at least minimize some of these ties from the national government, because they want their own kind of power back again. So this is state governments trying to recapture their power. It's a political movement that's going on, and that's about it. So they're still dealing with even these kinds of monies, but now we're talking about, who's really in charge. So that's kind of where we get to conflicted federalism, and we're in the midst of that even now. So that's it. Have a great day.